The first thing I noticed when I moved into the old building was the silence. It wasn't just the usual kind of silence that filled an apartment at night. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of silence, like the building itself was holding its breath. The walls seemed to hum with it. I had always been someone who loved the quiet, but this was different. I had just moved into the apartment in the hopes of escaping the noise and chaos of the city. Austin had always been vibrant, buzzing with life, but I had grown tired of the constant hum of traffic, the endless chatter of strangers. This little apartment building, tucked away on a side street, far from the nightlife, seemed like the perfect place to start over. I wanted peace, and for the first few days, I thought I had found it. The building itself was old, probably dating back to the 1960s, but well maintained. It had the charm of a building that had seen a lot in its time, with its chipped white paint and creaky floors. The landlord was a reclusive woman in her late 60s who rarely spoke more than a few words to me when we crossed paths. She was a solitary figure, and that suited me just fine. The fewer interactions, the better. But then there was the door. It was across the hall from my apartment, just a few paces away. It seemed ordinary at first glance, just a simple wooden door with peeling paint and an old brass knob. But something about it made me uncomfortable. There was no number on the door, no nameplate, nothing to indicate what it led to. At first, I thought it was some kind of storage closet. But when I passed it in the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door was always locked. That wasn't odd in itself, but there was something off about it. There was no keyhole, no handle, just a solid surface with a faint outline of where a doorknob should have been. As I got used to the apartment, I began to realize that I wasn't the only one who noticed it. The other tenants, those few I occasionally saw, seemed to avoid the door. They never looked at it, never even spoke of it. I couldn't help but wonder what was behind it. There was an eerie silence surrounding the door, an unsettling stillness that made it feel like it was watching me. Every time I passed by, I felt it, a subtle pressure, a weight pushing against my chest, the feeling that someone or something was on the other side, waiting. A week went by. I tried to ignore it, focusing on settling in, unpacking, and adjusting to the solitude. But no matter how many times I walked past that door, the feeling never went away. It was as though the building itself was trying to warn me. One evening, I was returning from a long day at work. The building was quiet as usual, the dim light of the hallway flickering above me. As I approached my door, I noticed the sound, the faintest whisper, coming from behind the locked door. It was so soft I almost dismissed it, but it was there. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an old pipe groaning. But as I stood there listening, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something human. The whispers were muffled, indistinct, but there. And that's when I knew. Something was wrong with that door. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers had lingered in my mind long after I had gone to bed. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak in the stillness of the night. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the sounds I'd heard were just the house settling, or maybe some other tenant having a late-night conversation. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By morning, I had convinced myself that I would just forget about it. The whispers could have been anything, just the building's old plumbing, or maybe the wind finding its way through cracks in the walls. It didn't matter. I had my life to live, and I wasn't about to let a locked door get into my head. But as the day wore on, I found myself returning to that hallway, unable to resist the pull. I walked slowly past the door again, pretending to be casual, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to look. I had to know what was behind it. This wasn't just curiosity. It was a feeling, a compulsion that grew stronger with each passing hour. I glanced over my shoulder, making sure no one else was around. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, then took a breath and turned the handle. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The door gave way with the softest creak, and a rush of cold air hit my face, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze. For a moment, I hesitated. The hallway beyond the door was pitch black, the shadows too thick to see through. I couldn't hear anything, not even the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. There was a heavy, oppressive silence that made it seem as though the darkness itself was alive, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped through the threshold, my heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, as if it had been waiting for just that moment. I spun around, expecting to see it. A hallway, a stairwell, some kind of room. But there was nothing but an endless stretch of darkness. The walls were peeling here too, but unlike the rest of the building, this hallway had a strange, damp smell. It wasn't like old wood or dust. It was the scent of something musty and decayed, like wet earth after a heavy rain. I took a few steps forward, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. I couldn't see any lights, so I fumbled around in my pockets for my phone, hoping to use the flashlight. But when I turned it on, the beam barely pierced the darkness. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of me, narrowing as it disappeared into the blackness. I swallowed hard, feeling an icy chill creep up my spine. There was something off about this place. The air was thick and suffocating, the walls closing in on me, even though I couldn't see them clearly. I could feel them, though. It was as if the hallway itself was alive, breathing. Then came the whispers again. At first, it was faint, a murmur just at the edge of hearing. But as I walked further, it became clearer. Words, fragmented and unintelligible, seemed to swirl around me. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the walls or from somewhere deeper in the hallway. But I knew one thing. They weren't normal. They weren't human. The voices were low, guttural, like something trying to communicate but unable to form words. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse racing. I wanted to turn back. But when I looked over my shoulder, the door, the way I had come in, was gone. In its place was more hallway. It stretched on, dark and uninviting. There was no sign of the exit, no indication of where I was or how to leave. The air seemed to grow colder, and the whispers grew louder. They were now an incomprehensible chant, a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the floor beneath my feet. My stomach churned with fear, but I took another step forward, against my better judgment. I had no idea how far I had walked. I had no sense of time, no sense of space. All that mattered was the sense of being watched. I could feel eyes on me, all around me, from the shadows in the corners. And though I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. As I walked deeper into the hallway, I noticed something odd on the floor. There was a series of strange symbols drawn in what looked like chalk. They were scattered across the floor, arranged in a pattern that made my head spin. Some were circular, others more jagged and broken, like the remnants of something old and forbidden. The closer I got to them, the more the whispers intensified, becoming louder, more frantic. I stepped carefully around the symbols, my heart pounding. I was afraid they meant something I couldn't understand. But as I moved further into the darkness, I realized that there was no turning back. The hallway seemed to bend and twist before me, but no matter which direction I tried to take, I ended up back at the same place. Panic began to set in. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers grew more intense, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. My legs felt like lead, my breath short and ragged. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, from the shadows ahead, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shape barely visible in the darkness. But as it moved closer, I could make out more details. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and distort in the shadows. Its face was featureless, just a blank canvas, like a mannequin that had been abandoned and left to rot. The figure took a step toward me, and I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in place by the overwhelming presence of the figure that moved toward me, like a predator closing in on its prey. As it got closer, the whispers stopped. Everything went silent. And then, without warning, the figure lunged. The figure lunged toward me, faster than I could react, its long arms reaching out with an unnatural speed. I felt a cold hand brush my skin, and it was as if the world froze in that moment. My body refused to obey. My limbs were heavy, paralyzed by a deep primal fear that I couldn't explain. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth felt dry, like I had forgotten how to breathe. The figure was inches away from me now, its face still blank and featureless, its body stretched unnaturally tall. Its presence overwhelmed me, pressing in on all sides, suffocating me with an energy that felt more ancient and malevolent than anything I could understand. But just as the thing was about to reach me, I did the only thing my terrified mind could think of. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was running to, but my instincts screamed that I had to get away. The darkness seemed to close in behind me as I sprinted down the endless hallway, the floor beneath me cold and unyielding. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That thing, that presence in the dark, was still out there. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and for just a moment I thought I saw something shift in the shadows. A long, thin figure just at the edge of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and warping as if it were alive, changing shape, disorienting me. I tried to make sense of it, but my mind refused to cooperate. The further I ran, the more the hallway seemed to twist and stretch, its walls bending like rubber, pushing me deeper into the darkness. It felt like I was running through an impossible maze, one that had no exit, no end. And that's when I realized something even more terrifying. I had no idea where I was anymore. The floor beneath me shifted. I stumbled, falling to the ground as the surface seemed to give way. My hands scraped against the cold concrete, and for a moment, I lay there, panting and disoriented. It was as if I had been transported somewhere else, deeper into this twisted space. The whispers had started again, louder now, like a cacophony of voices, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Their words twisted through the air, circling around me, their volume growing until it felt like the voices were inside my skull, clawing at my brain. I managed to pull myself up, my legs shaky as I stood, still gasping for air. My body was drenched in sweat, and the cold, damp air of the hallway seeped into my skin, making me shiver uncontrollably. I had to find a way out. There had to be an exit, a door, anything that would lead me back to the normal world. But then, ahead of me, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, At the end of the hallway was another door. It was the same as the one I had entered through, the one that had led me into this nightmare. But this time, the door was slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light came from behind it, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't know if it was a trap, a cruel illusion meant to lure me deeper into this twisted place, but it was the only hope I had left. I staggered toward it, my legs aching with every step. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder with every inch I took toward the door. I could feel their presence, the weight of their malicious intent pressing on me from every direction. It was like the walls themselves were alive, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling as I gripped it. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, a strange sensation washed over me. It was as if something inside the door had been waiting for me. The temperature in the hallway dropped, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should open it. But there was no choice. I had to know. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. What I saw beyond it made my blood run cold. Beyond the door was not a hallway, not a room, but a vast, empty void. The light flickering from within the doorway illuminated only a small patch of the void, but everything beyond that was black. Endless black. I couldn't see anything. There were no walls, no floor, just a bottomless chasm of darkness that seemed to stretch out forever. I stepped forward, almost on instinct, but as soon as my foot touched the floor, I felt a sudden pull. Something tugged at me, a force stronger than gravity, dragging me forward towards the endless black. I tried to stop, but it was useless. The force was too strong, and before I could react, I was falling. I fell for what felt like an eternity, the darkness swallowing me whole. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, filling my ears with a sound that was both terrifying and maddening. It was as though the entire universe was screaming at me to stop, to wake up, but I couldn't. I tried to scream, but no sound left my mouth. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. I opened my eyes, unsure of where I was. The first thing I noticed was the smell, the stench of decay, of rot, of something dead. It made my stomach churn, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was lying on a cold, damp floor, the shadows around me deeper than I could comprehend. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of void, a place between the living and the dead. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning. As I looked around, I realized I wasn't alone. There, in the far corner of the room, was the figure. It was the same one I had seen earlier, but now it was different. It had grown. Its body stretched unnaturally long, its arms reaching down to the floor. Its face, once featureless, was now twisted, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. And it was smiling, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows upon rows of jagged teeth. The figure raised one long, bony finger toward me. It didn't say anything. It didn't have to. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to stay. The figure's finger pointed directly at me, but it didn't move. It just stood there, its elongated body swaying slightly in the darkness, as if waiting for something. The smile stretched wider across its grotesque face, and though no sound came from its mouth, I could feel it speaking to me. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room, the words unintelligible but suffused with purpose. The void around us seemed to pulse with the figure's presence. It was as if the very space we occupied was alive, breathing, reacting to its every movement. The room wasn't just a room, it was part of this thing, a piece of it, an extension of whatever malevolence had created this place. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my throat was dry, and the oppressive air weighed heavily on my chest. I could barely breathe, let alone speak. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. All I could do was watch as the figure took a slow step forward, its impossibly long legs bending in unnatural ways. As it moved closer, I noticed something I hadn't before. The ground beneath it wasn't solid. It rippled like liquid, each step sending out faint waves that dissipated into the void. The figure didn't seem to walk so much as it glided, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it existed in a different dimension altogether. And then it stopped. The whispers abruptly ceased, plunging the room into an eerie silence. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Its smile faltered, replaced by an expression that could only be described as hunger. "Why did you come here?" The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was deep, guttural, and it echoed all around me, reverberating through my very bones. It didn't come from the figure itself. It came from everywhere, as if the void was speaking to me directly. I couldn't answer. My mind was a swirling storm of fear and confusion. All I knew was that I had made a terrible mistake. Whatever was behind that door, whatever had created this endless hallway, was not meant to be disturbed. The figure took another step forward, its bony hand outstretched. My body finally reacted, adrenaline surging through me as I stumbled backward. My foot hit something solid, a wall, a doorway. I didn't care. I turned and ran. The whispers started again, louder and more chaotic this time, a cacophony of voices screaming in languages I couldn't understand. The ground beneath me shifted and buckled as I ran, the floor turning to liquid one moment and solid the next. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew that I had to get away. The hallway seemed to twist and warp around me, the walls stretching and contracting as if alive. Doors appeared on either side of me, flickering in and out of existence. Some were wide open, revealing glimpses of impossible landscapes, endless deserts, towering forests, cities bathed in crimson light. Others were tightly shut, their surfaces covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. I ignored them all. I couldn't stop. Stopping meant death, or worse. I could hear the figure behind me, its movements unnervingly fast despite its elongated form. The sound of its approach was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it getting closer. The air grew colder with each passing second, and my skin prickled as if icy fingers were brushing against me. Finally, I saw it. A door up ahead, different from the others. It was made of gleaming black wood, its surface smooth and flawless. It stood at the end of the hallway like a beacon, its brass handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. Something about it felt different. It didn't radiate the same malevolence as the other doors. It felt like an escape. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with exertion. The whispers reached a fever pitch, screaming incomprehensibly in my ears, but I didn't stop. My hand shot out, grabbing the handle, and I yanked the door open with all my strength. The moment I stepped through, the world shifted again. I stumbled forward, the ground beneath me solid once more. The air was different here, lighter, cleaner, though still tinged with an unfamiliar scent that I couldn't place. I straightened up, looking around, and my breath caught in my throat. I was in a room, a normal room. The walls were painted a dull beige. The floors were covered in cheap linoleum, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim yellow glow. It was utterly unremarkable, and yet something about it felt wrong. There were no doors, no windows, nothing to indicate where I was or how I had gotten there. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a book, its cover old and weathered, the edges of the pages yellowed with age. I approached it cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The book had no title, no markings of any kind. Its surface was plain, save for a faint symbol etched into the leather, a circle surrounded by jagged lines, the same symbol I had seen on the floor of the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for the book. The moment my fingers touched its surface, a surge of energy shot through me, making me gasp. The light bulb above flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. The whispers returned, softer this time, but filled with a strange urgency. I opened the book. The pages were filled with symbols, diagrams, and writing in a language I didn't recognize. But as I stared at them, the symbols began to shift and change, rearranging themselves into words I could understand. "The door is a threshold," the text read, "a gateway between worlds. Those who enter may never return. Those who disturb it must pay the price." My heart sank. I flipped through the pages, desperate for answers. The book spoke of an ancient force that dwelled in the spaces between reality, a being that fed on those who wandered too far into its domain. The hallway wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a labyrinth designed to lure in the curious and the foolish, and I had walked right into it. The final page of the book was blank, save for a single sentence scrawled in jagged handwriting: "The only escape is through sacrifice." Before I could process the words, the room began to shake. The light bulb exploded, plunging me into darkness. The whispers grew louder, angrier, and I could feel the presence of the figure once again, its icy breath brushing against my neck. I turned, and there it was. Its hollow eyes stared into mine, its smile now a grotesque rictus of teeth. It raised its hand, pointing at the book in my hands. "Sacrifice," it whispered. The figure's words echoed in the darkness, filling my head with a sickening sense of dread. "Sacrifice," it whispered again, its voice as cold as ice, as if it was savoring the very idea. The room was now suffocating, the walls closing in on me, the floor groaning beneath my feet. The very air was thick with malice, as if every molecule of oxygen had been poisoned by the presence of this thing. I clutched the book tighter, the weight of its knowledge pressing down on me. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices speaking in unison, urging me, commanding me. The figure's smile stretched wider, the hollow eyes boring into mine, reading every thought, every fear. I could feel its influence, an overwhelming compulsion to give in, to just accept it, to make the sacrifice it demanded. But what did it mean? Sacrifice what? Sacrifice who? My mind raced, panic rising like a tidal wave. I had no choice but to act, to do something. I couldn't let this thing claim me, consume me. The words in the book haunted me, the final page with its cryptic message: "The only escape is through sacrifice." The figure's hand reached toward me, and I could feel its coldness radiating from its fingers. It was so close now that I could almost touch it, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The room seemed to distort around me, the walls bending inward like a funnel, narrowing the space between me and the thing. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a countdown to an inevitable end. In a panic-driven impulse, I threw the book across the room, watching as it spiraled through the air and landed with a dull thud on the floor. But as soon as it touched the ground, the room seemed to recoil. The walls trembled, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the growl of a beast disturbed from its slumber. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices urging me to run, to do something. But I couldn't run. The room had no door, no windows, no way out. There was only this figure, this thing that had lured me into its trap, and I could feel its hunger, its endless thirst for something, for my soul perhaps, for my very essence. I took a step back, then another, until I was backed against the far wall. My chest heaved with fear, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The figure loomed before me now, too close to escape, its face contorting into a grotesque parody of a smile. The space between us seemed to bend, warp, as if the very fabric of reality was unspooling, unraveling under the weight of its presence. But then, something unexpected happened. A flash of memory, a brief, fleeting image, flickered in my mind. It was a memory of my mother, sitting by the fire when I was a child, reading me a bedtime story. Her voice was soft and comforting, a stark contrast to the horror surrounding me now. And in that moment, I realized what the sacrifice was. It wasn't my life. It wasn't my soul. It was something far worse. The room began to spin as the realization hit me like a tidal wave. The sacrifice wasn't physical. It wasn't blood or life or body. It was my very mind, my sanity, my ability to remember. The entity wanted to erase me from existence, not by killing me, but by taking my memories, by making me forget everything that had ever mattered. This is what it wants, I thought. It wants to erase me, to make me nothing. I wasn't going to let it. In a sudden burst of strength, I rushed toward the book. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know how, but I had to try. The book was the key. I could feel it in my gut. The whispers were relentless now, louder than ever, drowning out all rational thought. But I ignored them, focusing only on the book. I grabbed it, my hands trembling, and the moment I touched it, the world seemed to shift. The walls stopped closing in. The figure's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing as it seemed to lose focus. The air grew thick, oppressive, but the book in my hands pulsed with energy, a strange force that seemed to fight against the darkness. Without thinking, I opened the book again, flipping through its pages. The symbols blurred before my eyes, but I didn't stop. I didn't have time. My hands moved with urgency, turning page after page until my fingers landed on a section of text that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. It was written in a language I didn't understand, but somehow I knew what it meant. The book spoke of a reversal, a way to undo the sacrifice, a way to break the cycle, to escape the entity's grasp. But it came with a cost, a price that no one could ever truly be prepared for. I didn't care. I had to try. The figure was still standing there, but it was no longer moving, no longer smiling. It was frozen, as if the very act of reading these words had trapped it in place. "Let it be undone," I muttered aloud, reading the words that seemed to burn into my mind. The air around me shifted again, the whispers fading into a hum, and I felt the weight of something lift from my chest, as if the very presence of the thing was being erased. The figure let out a low growl, its hollow eyes widening. It tried to move, but its form seemed to distort, flickering like a broken projection. For a moment, I thought it was going to attack, to consume me. But then something incredible happened. The figure collapsed, its form folding in on itself like paper being crushed. It disintegrated into nothingness, vanishing in a cloud of dark mist. The room went completely silent. The air cleared, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me lifted. I stood there, trembling, the book still clutched tightly in my hands. The world felt different, lighter, as if the terrible weight of the hallway, the door, and the entity had been erased. The room around me no longer felt wrong. It was just a room, a normal, mundane room. And yet something was still there. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the back of my mind, the faintest whisper, like a distant memory trying to surface. But I pushed it away, focusing on the fact that I had survived. I had escaped. For now. Epilogue. A new beginning. The door across the hall was gone when I returned to my apartment. It had never been there in the first place. No trace of the strange figure, no sign of the hallway that had led me into that dark place. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I had imagined it all. But the book, the whispers, the figure, it all felt too real to be a dream. And as I settled back into my life, trying to piece together the fragments of what had occurred, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. A door might appear again, somewhere, sometime. And if it did, I would be ready.